This is the SF and SF podcast for October 2016. Recorded live at the American Bookbinders Museum, SF and SF is Science Fiction in San Francisco, a monthly series of author readings from the science fiction, fantasy, horror, and genre literary fields, hosted by Terry Bisson. And now, the coordinator of SF and SF, Rina Weisman.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Wow, it's so quiet all of a sudden. Jeez.
Because you told her to shut up.
Well, I just said welcome. I didn't go like so. Anyways, again, welcome to this very nice, quiet, well-behaved audience, which I'm sure will soon change because you're all so excited to be here, right? Yes! Well, I am too. I am Rina Weisman. I'm the coordinator for SF and SF, Science Fiction San Francisco. We think it's a perfect fit. We've been doing this since about 2004, give or take a few months. So we've got quite a few of these under our belt, but there are always things that I forget. We have books for sale, courtesy of Borderlands Books, who is our bookseller for the event series. Yay! Our event is also being podcasted by SomaFM. We have Rusty and Marin here doing a wonderful job, which means that you'll be able to listen to this in its entirety, the readings, the introductions, the Q&A. One thing we do, and I like to think we do it pretty well, is we offer author events once a month here at the beautiful American Bookbinders Museum in San Francisco. Before we were at Variety, some of you have been with us through many years, different locations. Before that, with Karen Williams and Terry Bisson at the helm of the series, we were at New College, which is now a distant memory and has turned into the Chapel, which I understand is a really rockin' venue, so you should support that too. But one of the things we do, all our events are meant to raise money. So your largesse at the bar and by buying tickets at the door for the events, all that goes to the American Bookbinders Museum and helps make a dent in their nonprofit debt, as every nonprofit has. But we really love the place. It's a fabulous resource. We want to make sure they stay around. So thank you again for helping to contribute to that. That's much appreciated. What I would like to do next is introduce Madeline Robbins, who helps run this amazing, amazing space we found ourselves in. And she'll explain a little bit about the funky-looking machinery that you all saw on your way in. Madeline?
Who are you calling funky looking? Hi, welcome to the American Bookbinders Museum. We were started by a career bookbinder, a fellow by the name of Tim James, who started picking up pieces of machinery in the process of making sure that his own binding was working well. And he has become really an authority on the subject of bookbinding during the period going from hand bookbinding to the mechanized Lulu.com kind of possibilities that we have now. Most, if not quite all, but most of the machinery that you walked by is operational. I get to play with it when I give a tour. It is possible if you come in and do a tour, you can pull a print on letterpress. There are other cool things that we do. But I encourage you all to come back. We are open to the public from Tuesday to Saturday. We have 5 tours a day. We break for lunch, so it's 10, 11, 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you, Madeline. One last bit of acknowledgement. All of this is possible thanks to our sponsor, which is a wonderful independent press located here in San Francisco called Tachyon Publications, with which I have zero connection despite being married to the publisher. But I don't work for him, so. But I highly recommend their books. Check them out at tachyonpublications.com. Among their current offerings is Peter Beagle's first novel since Tamsin called Summerlong. And if any of you have watched The Last Unicorn, you're going to want to pick up this book. So thank you again to all of you being here on this fine evening. I'm going to let the party begin and turn it over to Terry Bisson, our moderator. Thank you.
Well, let's cut right to the case, right to the chase, as they say. So we have 2 interesting authors. who are going to read, then we're going to take a little break, then we're going to have a Q&A and a discussion about their work. Our first author is, in fact, a debut author, but one who came to the field not totally green, and whose first novel turned out to be a Nebula nominee, a World Fantasy nominee, a Mythopoeic Award winner, and a New York Times bestseller from HarperCollins. It was called The Golem and the Jinn. And I would like to introduce Helene Wecker.
Thank you. Thank you to Rina, to this gorgeous museum, to Terry. Okay, so this is a weird question. How many of you have read the book? Okay, not too many. So the first few readings.
That's a lot.
I know. No. Okay, well, see what? Okay, when like the first 6 months that I was doing readings after the book came out, like there was one reading where I looked out in the audience and I said, okay, how many of you were not at my bat mitzvah? And literally 5 people raised their hands, 2 of whom I'd met like when I was in my 20s. So, you know, it's the reason that I ask is because, so The Golem and the Jinni has been out in the world since 2013. And because I am the world's slowest writer, there has not been a new book out until now. No, the new book out isn't coming out until 2018, sorry. But I'm currently at work on the sequel, which is called The Iron Season, and will, with, you know, the help of any supernatural force that is out there, will be out in 2018. But so I was trying to decide what to read today, and I was like, I can't read anything that, you know, I don't want to read from the book. I've been reading from the book that's out for like so long. I want to read something from the sequel, so I chose something and I practiced it. And then my husband, as I was literally leaving the door, said, so what are you reading tonight? And I told him what I was reading from the sequel. Now, he is one of 2 people, the other being my agent, who has seen anything from this sequel. And he looked at, so I told him the scene, and he looked at me and he said, but that spoils the entire first book. And I said, don't talk to me, I'm leaving. So I got on the BART, and I sat there on the BART, and I'm like, damn it, he's right. I have the sequel with me on my iPad. Let me pull up the other scene that he suggested helpfully as I was walking out the door fuming. So I was thank God we live out in Pleasanton, which it is the sticks, but it's a nice long BART ride to the city, just long enough to edit 20 pages down to 15. So this is a stunt reading because I've never read these words out loud before. So this is what you're going to get. No one has heard this stuff before, including me. What you need to know is that this takes place in Manhattan on the Upper East Side in the year 1900. On a windy and sunless February afternoon, a man and a girl exited the 3rd Avenue elevated at 67th Street into the blistering cold and walked 3 long blocks westward, hand in hand. They passed the immense stronghold of the 7th Regiment Armory and crossed Park Avenue, barely glancing at the trees that ran the length of the street, their branches long since stripped by the season. Other pedestrians stared at them as they passed by, for the 2 were an unusual sight in this neighborhood. The man in his long, dark coat and broad-brimmed hat, his side curls bobbing above his scarf. The girl, perhaps 7 years old, in her old-fashioned dress and heavy woolen shawl, her boots thick-soled as a farmer's. At Lexington, the man spent a few minutes pacing back and forth and scowling at the apartment numbers until the girl at last found what they were looking for, a narrow door labeled Benevolent Hebrew Aid Society. They opened the door and climbed the flight of stairs inside to another door, the twin of the first. The man hesitated, then straightened his back and knocked. From the other side of the door came a loud and excessive sigh. Footsteps, and then the door was opened by a young man in spectacles and a trim American suit. If circumstances had been otherwise, indeed, if both men had been slightly different men, The man in the overcoat might have shaken the other's hand and introduced himself as Lev Altschul, and the girl at his side as his daughter Clariel. The man in the suit, whose name was David Fleischman, might have thanked Mr. Altschul for coming so far in such dismal weather. Over tea and biscuits, the men would have discussed the task that had brought them together, namely the disbursement of the private library of one Rabbi Avram Meyer, recently deceased. Mr. Fleischman would have explained that his charity specialized in book donations, which is why the late Rabbi Meyer's nephew, a man named Michael Levy, had chosen them. But that once the collection had arrived and crate after crate of leather-bound Talmudic esoterica was unloaded into their office, it had become clear that, in this case, they would need to summon a specialist. In response, Mr. Altschul would have outlined with something approaching modesty his own qualifications for the task, that his family was known throughout the city of Vilna, indeed throughout all of Lithuania, for their fine Talmudic scholarship, and that he'd spent 30 years of his life surrounded by books such as these. He might have told Mr. Fleischman that the BHAS had made the right choice when they'd asked his own rabbi for a recommendation, and that Rabbi Meyer's books would all find new and appropriate homes, where they'd be treated with the care and reverence that such volumes deserved. Thus satisfied that they were working together toward a common purpose, the two men would have turned to their work in relative harmony. But none of this came to pass. What happened instead was that each man raised his eyes to gaze balefully at the top of the other man's head, one garbed in Orthodox hat and side curls, the other in the Reform manner, as bare as a Gentile's. In silence, the two men stared at each other over the threshold. Lev Altschul, the man in the overcoat said at last, and then pointed to the girl. Clariel Altschul. Fleischman made no reply. He had decided that his own name was unnecessary to the proceedings. Instead, he stepped back and to one side, allowing the Altschuls to see the 4 large library tables that took up most of the charity office, their scarred wooden tops nearly invisible beneath stacks and rows and pyramids of books. Lev Altschul's sigh was that of a man catching a glimpse of his beloved. Fleischman broke his silence, indicating the 2 tables nearest the door. These, he said, were Rabbi Meyer's books, the ones that needed sorting and cataloging. Mr. Altschul would need to label each group with its appropriate destination. But now the man paused as a faint whisper broke across his words. It was the girl, Clariel. She was speaking quietly at her father's side, translating Fleischman's instructions into Yiddish. Frowning with impatience, Fleischman waited for the girl to finish, but then Altschul asked his daughter a question in the same language. She seemed to hesitate, but the man gestured. Go on. In a quiet, thickly accented voice, the girl said, My father would like to know why Mr. Levy did not keep his uncle's library, since it must have been his greatest possession. Fleischman frowned. What right did Altschul have to pry into a grieving man's decisions? What business was it of his? But the question hung there, and to ignore it would be beyond the barest civility. So he told Clariel that Mr. Levy was a social worker, not a scholar like his uncle, and had decided to give the books to others who would better appreciate them. But Altschul had seen the uneasy look on the man's face and heard the stiff tone in his voice. And even before his daughter had finished translating, he gave a dry and knowing laugh. A meshumed, he said to the girl. Is a meshumed. He shook his head, went to the tables, and began to examine the books. Clariel glanced nervously between the 2 men, wondering if she was obligated to translate. A meshumed was an apostate, a traitor, but she didn't know how to say the word in English, and it seemed a rude thing to call someone, even if he wasn't in the room. Besides, from the scowl on the other man's face, it was clear that he had understood enough. The men returned to their silence, and Altschul settled into his work. As he walked up and down the tables, running his forefinger along the rows, the scope of the late rabbi's trove of knowledge grew and took shape in his mind. The titles told him that the rabbi's theology had been of a far more mystical bent than Altschul's own, edging even towards anathema. In fact, if the 2 men had ever encountered each other in Talmudic argument, Altschul might have had harsh words for the rabbi. But standing in this cold and alien office with the rabbi's library, forsaken by his own flesh and blood, laid out before him like the contents of a bookmonger's cart, Lev could only feel a deep and sympathetic grief. In this room, he and the rabbi were brothers. He would overlook their differences and disperse his legacy as best he could. Fleischman, meanwhile, had retreated to a small desk in a nearby corner and watched his guests while pretending to leaf through a newspaper. Crindle also watched her father, if more surreptitiously. Simply seeing him during a weekday afternoon was a rare occurrence. He'd been waiting for unexpectedly after school, and on seeing him, her heart had thudded with fear that something had happened to her mother. But no, he said, he needed her to come uptown with him. Her chores could wait. Her mother knew that this was more important. Her confusion and excitement had only grown as he explained their errand on the elevated. She could hardly imagine a less likely outing. Lev Alchul was the sort of man who needed an enemy to square himself against, and having escaped the Tsar's regime, he had filled the resulting vacancy with the Uptown Reform Charities and their settlement workers, young pink-cheeked German Jewish women who wandered the Lower East Side tenements, knocking on doors, offering the ladies who answered free milk and eggs if they agreed to endure a lecture on modern hygiene and nutrition. "You're in America now," the refrain went. "You must learn to cook properly." Lev Alchul had issued an edict that no such woman was ever to set foot in their apartment. Their charity, he'd said, was like a juicy worm that covered a sharp and deadly hook. And on the streetcar, his grimly determined cast had suggested that they were venturing into a pit of serpents. Now, however, Crindle was growing faintly bored. The office was nothing like what she'd expected. No marble floors or velvet-covered furniture. Only bare furnishings and the thin, sour man who insisted on turning each page of his newspaper with a rattle and a snap. And, of course, the books. She had never seen so many books in one place before. She wished that she, too, could leaf through them, pick up whichever one she fancied and study its contents. But of course it would be impossible, for the rabbi's books were all in Hebrew, and although her English was the best among her classmates, and her Yiddish was of course faultless, she had not been taught Hebrew, for holy scholarship was the work of men, not women. She'd lamented the lack before in a resigned sort of way, but never before had she felt it this strongly, as though the sight of an unreachable banquet had made her realize she was famished. Well, the rabbi's books were only on the front two tables. What about the other two? With one eye trained on her father, his back was half turned to her and he was humming to himself as he sorted the books into their piles. She wandered down the length of the table and then peered across the aisle. The spines she could see were in English, clear and tantalizing. The historical poetry of the ancient Hebrews. The American Jew as patriot, soldier, and citizen. Reform Judaism and its pioneers. She glanced up at her father, still absorbed in his work. How odd to think that she could read these titles and not he. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the aisle. Some of the books were in stacks, each with a piece of paper atop it, with a name and address written in English, of congregations in other cities, Charleston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Chicago. And then, atop one large stack, a piece of paper with only a name in large letters, Asylum for Orphaned Hebrews. Crindle's breath caught. She'd heard of the asylum. Everyone had heard of the asylum, and most knew someone who had ended up there besides, for any number of reasons. A mother dead, a father disappeared, or simply too many hungry mouths under one roof. The orphanage was even farther uptown than this office, up where the streets were numbered in the hundreds, and in Crindle's imagination, it squatted there like Baba Yaga's hut, stealing Jewish children into its bowels. According to her father, the asylum masters taught their young inmates to forget their Yiddish, their religion, and their families. The asylum, he liked to say, was simply another weapon in the war against them. Furtively, Crindle examined the books beneath the paper tag. They were prayer books, most of them the same identical volume. Slowly, very slowly, Crindle removed the label from the stack. Then she picked up the top volume and opened the cover. Daily Prayers for American Israelites, the frontispiece said in English. The pages of text she saw mirrored each other, one side in English and the other in Hebrew. How funny, she thought, and in English she read, Morning Prayers for Public Service, 10 adults, male or females, to make a minyan. She stared at the words, all of which she understood individually, but together made little sense. The minyan was the quorum required for worship, but it was 10 men. Women were not counted in a minyan. She knew this to her bones. She passed a thumb over the word females, half expecting it to smudge and vanish from the page. Crindle! She jumped in fright. The prayer book fell from her hands and landed with a thud, spine-tented, pages fanned against the floor. Her father strode over. His eyes were thunderous. He bent and picked up the book, scanning its pages only long enough to see the contraband his daughter had absorbed. He snorted in annoyance and then replaced the book on its stack. Taking her by the shoulder, he marched her away from the English books to the front of the office near the door. Then he returned to his work, but not before giving her one last significant glare of warning. The man in the suit had jumped too at Lev's outburst, and now he glowered at her as well. Crindle tried to shrink in on herself, hands balled in her cloak. Not until after the man had sat down again and picked up his paper, rattle, snap, did she realize that she was still holding in her pocket, nestled alongside her gloves, the label that had sat atop the stack of books. There was nowhere for her to put it without it being seen. So, not knowing what else to do, she simply kept it there, a small and accidental theft. Her father, meanwhile, was so unnerved by Crindle's transgression, what evil thought had convinced him to bring her here, that it took him a moment to notice that his progress through the books had brought him to a small stack whose character was far different than the rest. The contents of the rabbi's library were venerable, but most of the books themselves were modern editions, few more than 100 years old or so, well thumbed and well cared for, the library of a true scholar. Now, however, Lev lifted from the table a book that was considerably older and more worn than its neighbors. Of the leather that had once covered the books, there were only shreds and clinging traces. The covering of the spine had flaked away, revealing narrow bundles of pages held together by opaque and fraying strands of catgut. Suppressing an odd shiver, Lev opened the book carefully, and his frown deepened as he turned the pages, skimming formulae, diagrams, pages of close-written Hebrew. He could barely read most of it, but the fragments he understood told of theories and experiments and the sort of abilities that, should the tales be believed, were forbidden to all but the holiest of the sages. What in the name of God had Meyer been doing with a book like this? He closed it and put it to one side, his hands trembling with unease. And now he saw that the next book in the stack was just as worn and ancient seeming as the first. And so was the next book, and the next. 5 in all he found, 5 books of secret knowledge that most scholars thought had vanished into history, their contents surviving through only legend and story. And now here they were in America, in a Reformed charity office of all places. Lev Altschul was a pious man, but he was not a saint, and for a moment avarice clutched at him. How easy it would be to give some excuse and take the books himself. But then what would he do with them when he couldn't even look at their pages without cowering? These were relics, holy objects. He should have prayed and fasted before even touching them. Were they to sit on a shelf in the tenement apartment where his wife cooked cabbage soup and noodle pudding? No, he would send them as quietly as possible to a qualified rabbi who could best judge their fate. He looked up. The bare-headed man was still reading his newspaper, and Crindle was near the door where he'd left her, staring guiltily at her shoes. Good. The girl was growing far too curious for his comfort. Carefully, he moved the books to one side, away from its neighbors. Then, as though nothing had happened, he went on to the next blessedly ordinary stack. But he imagined he could still feel his hands tingling, as though the forbidden knowledge had leached through the tattered covers and into his skin. At her spot near the door, unaware of her father's struggle, Crindle worried at the strip of paper in her pocket and wished her father would work more quickly. Her foot began to jiggle with impatience. In the back of her mind, a sentence sounded over and over, following the same restless cadence. 10 adults, males or females, to make a minion. 10 adults, males or females, to make a minion. Crindle, her father called to her, interrupting her thoughts. I need you to tell that man what to do with the books so we can leave this place. Fleischman listened with bare politeness as Crindle relayed her father's directions. These books, Crindle outlined with her hands one large group of stacks, were meant for advanced Talmud students and should be given to Rabbi Teitelbaum at Congregation Kol Yisrael at Hester Street. These books, she indicated another swath of small towers, were meant for younger students and should go to the school at Mariam Paul Synagogue on East Broadway. In this way, she went down the stacks while Fleischman grimly wrote the addresses on slips of paper and added them to the top of each. And these, Crindle gestured to a small, solitary pile of decrepit-looking volumes, must be sent to Rabbi Chaim Grodzinski, the Rav of Vilna. Fleischman's pen hovered above the paper. I'm sorry, who? Rabbi Chaim yes, but he lives in Vilna? In Lithuania? A whisper was exchanged between daughter and father. Yes, Kreindl said, the Rav is the chief rabbi of Vilna and a very important man. Fleischman was about to say that Grodzinski could be Elijah the Tishbite and it still wouldn't matter. They hadn't have the budget to ship a handful of decrepit prayer books to Lithuania. Did Altschul think they had a Rothschild hiding behind the coat rack? But at the last moment, he paused. Rabbi Chaim Grodzinski, he said. His pen scratched on the paper. Yes. The Rav of Vilna. Yes. And what is the address? More whispers. Care of the Grand Synagogue on Zidu Street. Spell that, please, in English. She did so, adding, they'll know where to find the Rav. Fleischman nodded. Of course they will. He tore the slip of paper from its pad and placed it atop the stack. Altschul looked at the paper and then at Fleischman. Fleischman stared back at him, eyebrows raised, silently daring him to comment or find fault. Altschul was in a quandary. Should he stress the rarity of these books and how important it was that they reach the Rav? Or would that only make the man grow curious about the books and decide to investigate their contents? At last, Altschul decided that the matter had passed out of his hands into those of the Almighty. It was a thought that came with some relief. And with that, their strange task was over, and father and daughter were shown to the door without ceremony. Kreindl was still worrying the slip of paper in her pocket, but at the last moment, a superstitious impulse pulled at her. Did she really mean to bring that talisman of the orphanage back home with her, into the warmth of her mother's kitchen? Not knowing what else to do with it, she couldn't put it back on the stack of prayer books, not without revealing she'd taken it in the first place. She made a pretense of putting on her gloves and let the paper drift to the floor. Then the door clicked shut behind her, and she followed her father back down the stairs and out to the street. In the following days and weeks, the strange phrase Kreindl had read in the Reformed prayer book would drift through her mind, coupled to the rhythm of her feet as she walked, or her hands as she pounded dough or scrubbed the laundry, or even at Sabbath services as she sat in the women's balcony watching the men as they prayed. 10 adults, males or females, to make a minyan. 10 adults, males or females, to make a minyan. When she wanted to frighten herself, she'd think of the warm slip of paper she'd held in her pocket, and a shiver would run through her as though it had been the key to the asylum itself. But time passed, and the year lengthened, and other thoughts grew to occupy her as she hung out the laundry or sat in the synagogue balcony with her mother, listening to the other girls whisper about the boys who were praying with their fathers below. As for the slip of paper, that too drifted from her mind. She would not even recall it years later, when she herself passed through the asylum's black iron gates and became its newest resident. She would only feel the chilling certainty that this had been foreordained, that by some long ago and unremembered fault, she herself had caused the catastrophe to happen. Fleischman closed the charity office door behind the Altschuls and let out a long, suppressed snort of indignation. He grabbed the offending slip of paper from atop the small stack of ancient books, crumpled it, and tossed it in the wastebasket. The Rav of Vilna, indeed. Resolving to forget the matter as soon as possible, he donned his coat and went home to supper. Early the next morning, a more junior volunteer arrived to ready the books for delivery. Slowly, the man traveled down the tables, lifting the stacks into their Excelsior-lined crates. When he reached the stack of prayer books that had so fascinated Kreindl, the lack of label was no surprise. The charity had been collecting prayer books for the orphanage for months, and he added the stack to the correct crate without a second thought. The only other stack without a label was the one that had given Lev Altschul so much trouble, and this time the man could not guess a destination. Puzzled, he looked around and finally spied a slip of paper on the floor where Kreindl had let it fall. He picked it up and read it, then looked again at the books, and at last shrugged and added them to the crate. There was just enough room, as though they were meant to fit there. He topped the books with a thin pad of Excelsior, nailed the lid in place, and wrote on the side, "Asylum for Orphaned Hebrews." Thank you.
Well, I have a question too, but we'll put that off and push on. Our next reader was actually many years in the publishing business, as I was alarmed to discover, and then decided to take up writing. Got a story accepted by Gardner Dozois and George Martin for their Old Venus anthology, and was so inspired by that he went on to sell 5 million copies and
I think the chronology is a little bit mixed up there, but
that's okay. And is a world famous author with 3 series who works mostly in YA, mostly in fantasy, but always with his own twist on it. And at this point, I'll give you Garth Nix.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. I'm actually going to stand up to read because I'm slightly asthmatic. It's much easier to read standing up. I hope that still works with your microphone there. I feel very much at home here in the Bookbinders Museum because my mother is a papermaker and bookbinder. So many of these strange medieval torture instruments were familiar from my mother's studio below our house growing up. And she's a printmaker as well. So it's particularly splendid to be here. I feel it's very appropriate. And of course, hearing about ancient books of magic, I think, this is the right venue. We're in the right place. I'm going to do some short readings from Golden Hand, which is the 5th book in the Old Kingdom trilogy. No, that doesn't work. It's the fifth book in the Old Kingdom series. So a couple of short readings from that. But like an infomercial, I'm not going to read just from one book, but 2 books. So I'm also going to give you a little sneak preview from Frog Kisser, which comes out at the end of February as well. It's an unusual situation for me to have this book just out and another one already done. But a few segments from Golden Hand. And because Golden Hand has a number of converging stories, I'm going to read the beginnings of some of those individual stories that later converge. I was looking at this and similarly, I was wondering what I could read that wasn't a spoiler. And I've been on tour for the last 2 weeks and trying to work out what I could read that's not a spoiler. And I narrowed it down to 3 words, actually. So it's going to be quite a short reading. No, here we go. So this is from the prologue of Golden Hand. In the 6th precinct, the inexorable current of the river that flowed through death slowed almost to a stop. It was a natural gathering place for the dead who hope to go no farther, and for those who strive to claw their way back through 5 gates and precincts and out into the living world again. Amid the myriad dead who waited and hungered and fought against the compulsion to go deeper into death, there were 2 living people. Necromancers, of course, for no others could be here while still alive, at least alive for the moment, for unwary necromancers going deeper into death than their knowledge and their strength allowed were the particular prey of the greater dead who prowled the precinct, ever eager to consume any scrap of life that would aid them in their desperate desire to live again. But in this case, the greater dead stayed well away, knowing that 2 women were most uncommon necromancers. Both wore bandoliers containing the 7 bells, necromantic tools of power infused with free magic, but their bells had mahogany handles rather than ebony, and the silver bell metal crawled with bright charter marks. That alone declared their identity, but it was confirmed by their apparel, armoured coats made from many overlapping plates of a material called gethra, with surcoats over the armour. One wore deep blue, sprinkled with many silver keys, the other a coat also with silver keys upon the blue, but quartered with golden stars in a field of green. The silver keys were the blazon of the Abhorsen, foe and nemesis of all things dead, and this was the Abhorsen Sabriel, 53rd of the line. With her was her apprentice Lirael, the Abhorsen in waiting, who also bore the stars of the Clare, to show her own unique heritage. She was not only an Abhorsen, but also a remembrancer who could see deep into the past, just as the Clare could see into the future. She has evaded us, said Sabriel, looking out over the grey and dismal river. So that's a little piece from the prologue. I'm sure nothing bad's going to happen. This is from Chapter 1. Chapter 1, an unlikely messenger at the gate. Winter was hard in the north, beyond the borders of the Old Kingdom. The nomadic clans who lived on the steppe would seek the lower reaches before the snow began to fall, leaving the high plateau. But there was one tribe that did not roam so far, whatever the season. They lived in the mountains in the northwest beyond the steppe, and did not ride or revere horses, though they would eat them if the opportunity presented itself. These mountain folk were easily distinguished from the other clans because they did not wear the long slit tunics and silk sashes of their nomadic cousins. Instead, they favoured jerkins and breeches made of patchwork goatskin, stitched with thick red thread, and rich cloaks from the fur of the Athask, the huge cats that roamed their peaks and gave the clan its name. For weddings, feasts, and their own funerary pyres, they donned heavy bracelets and earrings made of alluvial gold from their mountain rivers. It was unusual to see any of these folk outside their mountains at all, let alone hundreds of leagues to the south and east. So the guards in the gate tower of the Greenwash Bridge Company's North Bank Castle were understandably both curious and cautious when one such fur-wrapped, red-thread, goatskin-patched nomad appeared as if from nowhere out of a swirling wet snowfall on a spring afternoon and shouted up at them, asking permission to cross the bridge into the Old Kingdom. That's another little sample. And then from chapter 2, two hawks bring messages. The hawk came down through the clouds, dodging raindrops for the sheer fun of it, despite having already flown more than 200 leagues. Born from a charter-spelled egg and trained for its work since it was a fledgling, the hawk carried a message imprinted in its mind, and with it the burning desire to fly as swiftly as possible to the Tower Mews and the royal city of Belissaire. The rain-dodging hawk from the south beat another bird flying in from the north by half a minute, so it was the first to get to Mistress Finney, the chief falconer, while the later hawk had to be content going to the fist of an apprentice. As a matter of procedure, Mistress Finney checked the anklet on the bird to see where it had come from. Though she already recognised him, she knew all the message hawks of the Old Kingdom, having raised them herself, even if they were later assigned elsewhere and became only occasional visitors to the capital. "Waverley College, my lovely," she said softly, making her own peculiar tongue-clicking sound, one all the hawks knew from the egg. "What a long way, and over the wall too, my brave one. What's your message, dear?" The hawk opened its beak and spoke with a woman's voice, that of Magistrix Coel, who taught charter magic at Waverley College, in that strange land beyond the wall, where magic waned and then disappeared entirely, once too far south. "Telegram from Nicholas Sayre for the Abhorsen, extremely urgent," said the hawk. Thank you. So that's a little sample from Golden Hand. The audiobook is read by Maggie Wiles, who does a tremendous job. Some of you may know that the earlier books, Sabriel, Lirael and Abhorsen, were read by Tim Curry. When they first told me that they had Tim Curry to read those audiobooks, I thought, oh wow, there's another Tim Curry. But it actually was the Tim Curry. And even though he was not, he's such a marvellous reader, sadly he wasn't available because he's been ill to do Clariel or Golden Hand. But the two new readers do a marvellous job. And I'm going to read a little bit from Frogkisser now. You can probably guess what Frogkisser is about from the title. And the back says, "Talking dogs, mischievous wizards, an evil stepfather, loads and loads of toads. Such is the life of a Frogkisser." Now, I didn't see that before they put this on the advanced reading copy, and I said to my editor, "There's no toads in this book. There are no toads." And he was like, aren't they frogs and toads? Aren't they the same thing? I said, "No, they're not. There are no toads." So, it will not be on the finished copy, I can assure you. Frogkisser is the story of a young princess and her dog Ardent, who have to go on a quest to find the ingredients of a transmogrification reversal lip balm, which she needs to change back a prince who's been turned into a frog. So I'm going to read a little bit from Frogkisser. And this comes out in the end of February. It's been picked up by Fox, who are developing it to make it into a musical. It may not happen, but this book had the most incredibly fast Hollywood experience of any book I've ever been involved in. The Old Kingdom books backwards and forwards for many, many years, kinds of things set up, things falling down, and so on. This one, before it actually anyone had hardly even read it, it was bought. So, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, here we go. Chapter 1, in which Morven's den home is turned into a frog. The scream was very loud and went on for a very long time. Princess Anya, who was reading in the castle library, ignored it at first, but eventually lifted her head from her book to listen. "That sounds bad," said Godfrey the librarian in his quavering, high-pitched voice. Disturbed by the sound, he immediately turned into an owl and began to vomit up a nicely packaged parcel of bones from the mouse he'd had for breakfast. It was something he did when under stress. Turning into an owl, that is. The vomiting just came with the shape. It does, Anya frowned. It was her older sister Morven's screaming, which was not unusual, but the intensity and duration of this particular scream were quite out of the ordinary. Anya shut her book with an emphatic thump and latched it closed, since it was a copy of The Adventures of a Sorcerer's Typesetter's Apprentice, and the words inside would otherwise climb off the page and go wandering around the library. In fact, there were still several words missing from an earlier reading, including the particularly troublesome pair of instantly and forthwith, which Gottfried now believed had escaped the castle altogether, or had been eaten by one of the dogs. The screaming continued as Anya hurried out of the library, across the inner courtyard to the main part of the castle, and up the private stair to her sister's rooms. Morven was the heir to the kingdom, at least theoretically. The sisters had not one but two step-parents, so the matter of lineage was a complicated one. This was one of the most frequent questions Anya was asked later in life. How is it possible to have two step-parents and no actual parents? The answer ended up being rather straightforward. Their mother, who had been the ruling queen of the little kingdom of Trelonia, had died when Morven was 6 and Anya was 3. Their father remarried a year later to Countess Iselda. So they had a stepmother, who was expected to be quite evil, but mainly turned out to be a very enthusiastic botanist. She was not interested in the children at all, for good or ill, only in plants. But then their father died a year after his marriage to Countess Iselda, and their stepmother married Duke Rickard. So the girls had two step-parents. Their stepmother, the botanist, wasn't a huge problem. But as it turned out, their stepfather was evil and wanted to be the king. Though Morven should by rights be crowned when she turned 16 in 3 months' time, it was fairly certain Duke Rickard would somehow prevent this from happening. Perhaps he already has, thought Anya as she knocked on Morven's door. Not waiting for an answer, she went straight in. As expected, her sister was lying on a lounge in her receiving room, screaming at the ceiling and kicking her legs. Her maid Bethany was sitting on a stool nearby knitting. Large strands of the wool she'd stuffed in her ears hung down her neck. Anya leaned over her sister and waited until two things happened at the same time. Her presence was registered through the veil of tears, and Morven needed to take a breath. "What's happened?" asked Anya. Morven stopped screaming and started sobbing. Stepfather, guessed Anya. It was far more likely to be stepfather than stepmother. Anya hadn't even seen Iselda for the past month. She'd gone somewhere far off to collect a rare shrub or a sapling. Anya raised an eyebrow. She could normally translate Morven's sobbing speech, but this was beyond her. "Turned," said Morven at last. "Turned? Denham!" Morven started crying even harder. So hard the tears were flying horizontally out of her eyes. Anya stood back a bit, impressed that this was even possible. Rickard has turned Denham into something, translated Anya. One of the greater disadvantages of having Duke Rickard as an evil stepfather was that he was an accomplished sorcerer. Prince Denham was the latest total amazing love beyond any possibility of measuring of Morven's life. The son of one of the kings from the petty kingdoms near the coast, Denham was a thoroughly nice young man, one of the better princes in the continuous cavalcade that came to the castle to woo Morven. Anya liked Denham, and though he was thought he was unlucky to have soft, wavy blonde hair and blue eyes, of the sort that made Morven fall in love with people. As Morven was remarkably beautiful herself, with her raven hair and warm chocolate eyes, young men she fell in love with usually fell in love back, at least until she decided she liked someone else better. The spurned princes usually retired to their homes to write bad poetry and brood by the fire, or they went on a quest and in the process discovered that they also liked someone else better, or they got eaten by a dragon. Whether at home writing poetry, embraced by a new love, or in a dragon's stomach, they didn't come back. Getting turned into something was unusual. Denham must have been foolish enough to try to talk to Rickard over breakfast, or maybe even ask for Morven's hand in marriage, which to the Duke would have been the equivalent of volunteering for immediate transformation. If Morven was married, she would have allies, and it would be even more difficult to get rid of her. And without her gone, Rickard could never become the king. "What has Rickard turned Denham into?" asked Anya. "A frog," said Anya. "How unimaginative." Thank you.
Well, as everyone knows, that's the literature part. As everyone knows, the purpose of literature is to make criticism and commentary possible. So let's take a break of like 7 minutes and 23 seconds and come back and we will talk to both of these authors and see what they got to say, okay?
To find out how you can attend SFNSF or to see the upcoming schedule of readings, go to sfnsf.org. Or you can follow the event on Twitter at SFNSF Events and on Meetup under SFNSF Events.
Okay, folks, settle down, settle down. Okay, we're going to get rolling here again with what I think is always the best part of the evening, where you skewer the authors with questions they've only heard 100 times before. So think of original things. Ask them from the heart what you really want to know. You know, you've got, they're your captive audience tonight. So, but be kind, So anyway, so Helene and Garth will be signing once you are done picking their brains for advice and insight on the wonderful books that they have both written. And for now, I'm going to leave it to Terry Bisson to get you all rolling on that. Thank you.
Well, let's start with you guys. If people have an intelligent question, it can be not that intelligent, but interesting to other people, you know, that kind of thing. And you'll get the mic. So please, yourself, and then you're next. Okay.
This question's for Garth. I'd like to know something about the creation of a necromancer's bells, how that comes about.
The creation of the necromancer's bells, you mean where I got the idea, where the ideas came from, or actually how they are made in that world? The latter. The latter. I really don't like talking too much about things I haven't written about because I think it spoils some of the sort of power and mystery of the fantasy if you explain it too much. However, in the little piece I wrote called From the Journal of Idrak the Less Necromancer, it does allude to the fact that the bells are cast in death. So the bells are actually cast in the river of death. So it's a pretty straightforward procedure. No. So it is fraught with danger. They are, you know, I looked a lot into actually how bells are cast and bell metal and so on. But it's something I may well write about in a story, and that's always how I like readers to experience things about the Old Kingdom. I don't want to tell you about them. I'd like you to experience them in a story, and I may well do that, and particularly look at the casting of bells and some other aspects of the bells. This is probably a good point, actually. I do, in fact, have 2 bell charms to give away, 2 sterling silver bell charms. The last person who puts up that, no, not the last person. No, that's a bit cruel. So I do have 2 with me, I hope, that I haven't... I've been on tour for 2 weeks. Hopefully my brain hasn't totally turned to... When I started tour, I blamed jet lag for being really stupid, and at the end of it, I blame just being on tour. So I've got 2 little sterling silver bells. So there's little bell charms. There's a little booklet that tells you...
Does he get one?
About the... I think he should have one, actually. You're brave and asked the first question. Here, come and grab this one. No, thank you. It's got a kind of representative mark on it, which you can look in the booklet and it'll tell you which bell it is, except some of these are production samples because I've almost run out, so it may not be totally clear from the little booklet. And then the next one, does anyone actually have a birthday today? Any birthdays today, this week, like the week past? Which day? Next week? What about? Yesterday? Come on down yesterday, I'm sorry. I think yesterday. I think this is this is a smaller bell. I think this might even be Rina the Sleeper. I'm not sure. It's an ancient bell. It has the ancient finish.
It's an awesome bell.
Cool. They're all awesome. Yeah. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Oh, sorry, brother. I'm glad you asked that question because otherwise I may well have forgotten I had those 2 bells. So.
Well, I guess that's it. And then, now you had a question.
I actually have two questions for Garth. One of them, how do you pronounce the Bells' names? I know that's kind of an odd question. I'm sure you get it, though. And then the other one is, how did you come up with the idea or the storyline of Shade's Children? I don't understand, like, the what came into that. It's such an oddball kind of idea.
Sure. Well, the first answer is you can pronounce the names however you like. I mean, no, seriously, I actually think however the names sound in your head is correct for you.
That's the way Australians talk anyway. They can
Yeah.
pronounce English anyway.
That's right. So, I mean, seriously, I do think, you can say Sabriel, whatever, Lirael, the Bells. Astariel is probably the one that people get hung up on. I would say Astariel, but other people could say other stuff, Belgaea, Kibeth, Rana, Dairam, it's really whatever is in your head is fine. Shade's Children is my post-apocalyptic YA dystopian novel that I wrote 10 years before they were fashionable. So that was like bad timing on my part. Shade's Children, I don't always know where a book comes from. Like, there's many ideas go into a book. Often there's not one central idea. There's lots and lots of different ideas. With Shade's Children, I do basically know the spark of it because I was walking in a park near where I used to live long ago in Sydney, because Shade's Children came out in 97, and I was writing it in sort of 95, 96. And I was walking in the park, and at the end of the park, I discovered a railway tunnel, a disused railway tunnel. I was like, wow, I never knew that was there. I've lived here for a year. And there was a railway going into the depths under Sydney, under a suburb of Sydney, a disused one. And as I stood looking in the mouth of the tunnel, the city became completely silent. So and this is actually in the heart of Sydney. I was right next to the harbour. I couldn't hear any ferries, I couldn't hear any aeroplanes, I couldn't hear any people, couldn't hear any cars. It was as if everything had vanished. And I thought, what would happen if everyone vanished? And if you're looking in this tunnel mouth and everyone's gone. And of course, if everyone's gone, you've got no story. Like, who do you write about? There's no one left. So, the next step was thinking, well, at some point in the past, everyone over 14 vanished, and the people who were left, the children who were left, I'm just trying to imagine how frightening and terrible that would be, when if you were just under 14, you were suddenly the oldest, and you have to try and take command of what's happening. But the people who made that happen, or the things that made that happen, had other ideas. So, but really, it all came from that one moment. But then I started asking the classic questions you ask to make a story, which is, well, what if? What if everyone disappears? Okay, well, that's not going to work. What if everyone over 14 disappears? Well, who did that? Why did it happen? What happens next? So, it all built up from there. But of course, the tunnels are still a big part of it. And the city in Shade's Children is basically Sydney. I tried to make it so it could be almost anywhere, but it's pretty much Sydney. Yep.
Well, in the back there.
Hi, this is a question for Helene. I am really looking forward to reading your book now. A question about that. So I'm going to be reading your book and actually, I guess, learning about Jewish culture, because it's not something I know a lot about. So I'm wondering, how do you approach or consider or deal with cultural ambassadorship while writing kind of a fantastic tale?
Oy, good question. And it's
Cultural ambassadorship?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So it's okay. So you'll be learning. Hopefully, you will be learning, and not just me throwing a bunch of nonsense your way. Jewish, but also Arab American culture. So dealing. It's funny that you asked that because, and the reason that I prefaced the answer with what I just said was because cultural ambassadorship for me wasn't nearly the flop sweat inducing conundrum that portraying Arab Americans was to me writing the book. What it sort of came down to for me was to make sure that I had done my research. And to be very specific about drawing particular individuals in a way that made it clear that this was this person's Judaism, this was this person's Christianity. This was this person's atheism. And to put them in context that way, sometimes in opposition to other people, especially just two of the people you'll meet pretty soon, close to the beginning of the book, are a rabbi who was a very devout Orthodox rabbi, and his nephew, who is newly atheist. And that, I mean, so when I started off researching the book, I had this idea of what Judaism on the Lower East Side in 1900 looked like, and it was very much the Fiddler on the Roof sort of, you know, everyone, lots of singing and dancing and cabbage soup sort of stuff. And really it was the research that just sort of turned that around for me, and was like, wow, either they never taught me this stuff or I just wasn't paying attention, you know, in Hebrew school for all those years. And so that dealing with, sorry, to get back to the, if I'm dancing around the question here, honestly, really, it did just come back to research and to make sure I had references for everything. Because I do get emails like, well, you know, that wouldn't have happened. And I'm like, well, here's the letter in the book where it says it did. So it's really, I think, I sort of had to pretend that and sometimes I sort of had to pretend that I wasn't Jewish. I grew up Reformed. Orthodox Judaism in 1900, in some ways, was a completely different religion than anything that I grew up with. So it was sort of like learning anything else in that way. There's a long and convoluted answer for you.
Do you have a prize for him?
Oh, no, I don't. Here's an autographed picture of Barbara, what was her last name? I forget it. Anyway, sorry, no.
These are very good questions. You've got one, please. I like this. Usually this part is doesn't work, but today.
Well, first of all, thanks to both of you for coming and for reading. Mr. Nix, I have a question for you. The number 7 seems to bear significance in a lot of your works. I was wondering why, if you could talk about that at all.
It's just a coincidence. No, that's a very untruthful answer. No, I mean, certain numbers are very significant in many different cultures and mythology and religion and history. 7, 3, 7, 9. I mean, there's a reason there's 3 rings for the elf lords and 7 for the dwarf lords and so on. You know, some guy wrote that. No, these numbers are very significant through many, many different cultures, and they resonate very strongly for us because of it. So, you know, I feel they're significant to me. Readers feel they're significant. These numbers mean something. And one of my favourite books, and many authors' favourite books, is Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable. And if you get the old ones are the best, like an 1898 edition of Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable. It's a wonderful thing. It's actually online as well. But the print ones are much more fun because you can just thumb through and discover bizarre things that people believed in or strange legends and so on. It has a tremendous summary on the numbers 7 and 9 because there's so many things that they're in sevens. 7, none of which I can remember at its exact moment. I need someone to look up Brewers. But they're significant numbers. They've resonated all through history, across many, many different cultures, and that's why they feel important to us, and that's why I use them too, because I try and do that actually in all my fantasy, is try and anchor even things that are inventions of mine, like the 7 bells. They're still actually connecting with and resonating with past myth and legend, so they feel stronger, they feel more real.
Hi. My question, Newts Emerald is one of my favorite books that has, I grabbed it when it first came out and then had it stored away on my computer, hoarding it. But how did a gentleman such as yourself come to Georgia Hare? Because she's one of my favorites, and when I saw that was one of your inspirations, I was really surprised. And can we expect any more Regency
romances with magic?
Oh, and also, what's your favorite Georgia Hare book?
What's my favourite Georgette Heyer? I'm an enormous fan of Georgette Heyer's Regency romances. I don't like her detective stories, interestingly, though I do like many of her compatriots of that time, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy Sayers, and so on. What's not to like about those books? They are great adventure stories. They are funny. They're historically accurate. I mean, they're just great stories. I actually think many more men would read them if they had different covers. No, seriously, but a lot of it is about people restricting their reading because of what they think a book is based on its cover or by its category. So I try, as a child, I didn't pay any attention to any of that, so I just read everything. And I'm very glad I did, because if I hadn't done that, I would have missed out on all kinds of stuff, including Georgette Heyer. And I wanted to write, it's basically an homage to her, but of course, being me, I couldn't write a straight historical Regency romance. The magic crept in, so it has fantasy elements as well. I've got many favourite Georgette Heyers, but and some are better than others. Some are more straight than others. The funny ones I like the best, which is just more light-hearted. And probably my favourite is Friday's Child, and I just love it because the men are so stupid. The upper class twits. I mean, I think I'm a big fan of P.G. Wodehouse as well, and I think there's quite a strong resemblance between quite a few of Georgette Heyer's, sort of Regency fops and P.G. Wodehouse's, twits and drones. But in Friday's Child, I love the central love affair where it's kind of a marriage of convenience, but they do fall in love, but don't really realise they have. They're just sort of having fun being friends, and there's this coterie of best friend men who aren't very bright, but so well intentioned. And possibly my favourite line in all Georgette Heyer's is towards the end of that book, where one of the sort of idiot friends is a bit worried about that Greek chappie who's been following them around, and they're like, "What are you talking about, Ferdy? What Greek chappie?" And this older man says, "I rather fancy he means nemesis." It's a very funny moment. Anyway, you have to read the book. You had to be there. And yes, I've got notes for another one set in that world. Not a sequel, or not with Truthful Newington, but another, like Heyer did. She just revisited that world, not necessarily with the same characters, but it won't be the next thing I write. But somewhere down the track, I hope to do something there. So I think, read widely. Don't be put off by categories or covers.
I'm sure you have a prize for her, right?
I've run out of prizes. I could give you a frog kisser card. Here we go. I'm giving these away anyway, but I'll take someone's eye out. This is like, I'm going down stage with my guitar. No.
Okay, this is for Helene. You said that your current book is a sequel to the first book. The second one is a sequel to the first. And I was just wondering, do you have a specific ending to the series in mind that each book is working towards, or are you just more generally creating each book just in that general setting?
Oh, good question. The problem is, now that I'm writing another book, I'm getting questions that I haven't answered before, and I have to actually think about them. The answer is, I honestly don't know. I kind of want to, I don't want this to be the only series that I do. And it's weird in some ways for me to even think about it as a series. I certainly didn't design it that way. But I sort of by accident ended up with a couple of main characters who could conceivably just keep going on for as long as I want them to go on. I could even bring it up to present day if I wanted to, but I don't even know if I want to. Sometimes I think I would love to work on the Ian Banks model, which is, I don't know if anyone knows Ian Banks, I'm sorry, what am I saying in this crowd?
Yeah, I fancy this audience.
No one's heard of it. Everyone's like, who the hell's that guy? Where it's sort of like how he would do a novel in the Culture series, and then he'd do something else, and then he'd come back to the Culture series, and then something else. I think it would be fun to sort of do that, just sort of revisit, let's check in on our two main, on Chava and Amhad, and see how they're doing. after a certain number of years. But I think it'll end up coming down to what my publisher wants me to do at the end of the day, and how much leeway they give me. So, and if the second book sells. If it doesn't sell, I'll do something else, I guess. So, yeah.
Cool. It's you, a young lady there. Okay, thank you. I guess I have a lot of power here, which I'll try to exercise with discretion.
Hi, so this question's for either or both of you. You can answer it however you see fit. It starts with a little bit of a story, and that is, I once took an English class, and my teacher told me I was overestimating my readers by using the word portcullis. So, how do you guys feel when you're writing to an audience? How do you do that? Do you write to an audience expecting them to look up words like portcullis, or do you write to an audience expecting them to already know what it means? How do you handle that situation?
Did the teacher know what portcullis meant?
No, she this was a college class, by the way. A major college class? Yeah.
Well, it's a more general question.
You go first.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I personally think a knowledge of castle architecture is very important. No, it's a very good question, because it does come up, particularly when I'm writing children's books rather than young adult or books intended for adults. And I do have arguments with editors at times where they say, what is this word? I mean, they don't know what it is necessarily, and I'll say it's an archaic word. My basic philosophy is, if you can understand it in context what it means, and you can look it up on the internet, and it will actually tell you the answer and not some other weird thing when you first type it in, then I pretty much always want it to stay. I'll insist on it staying. There's been a few occasions where I have changed it because it's been so esoteric that
like
it's.
What?
Well, come on, Terry. You ask me the tough questions. Well, something like a medieval word that's really past. But portcullis. I mean, there's still. You visit the Tower of London, you'll see the portcullis. I mean, there's that kind of. It's still around, I think that's that. But a word that's really passed out of use and is actually you'd need to do like 10 minutes searching to find it. Even though I might know it and like it, I have reluctantly changed it. And also I like to make up words too. And I've occasionally had battles over those made up words where they're like, what is this word? I mean, the classic is the copy editor. You get the marginal note, not in MW, Merriam-Webster, which is, it's like, yeah, it's not an MW because I just made it up for this book. But
it will be.
but if you can understand it in context, I want it left in. But then I might work harder to make that context explain that word. So I'm all in favour of. But again, not in every paragraph because that would be too hard to read. So I guess you pick your battles.
Now, you must have had to deal with this.
Did I deal with this? I think sometimes I dealt with it. I don't know how much of it was about the vocabulary and how much of it was just about stuff that people don't live with now that they used to live with, that you sort of had to explain without explaining. A lot of delicate context sort of stuff. Like, you're going to make me think of something off the top of my head. Shirtwaists. Thank you. My gosh, Susan, you're there to save me.
That's a good example.
Yeah, a lot of shirtwaists, like the way the women's blouses used to have this sort of. You'll know exactly what I mean when you see it. It used to be like, if you think of a woman dressed in 1900s outfit, it was the white blouse that buttoned all the way down, and it had what's called a peplum, which is that the bottom part of it sort of belled out and covered the top of the skirt. And that whole thing was called a shirtwaist. And that was sort of the working woman's costume in the early 1900s, was a white shirt waist. You could get a little frilly if you wanted to, and that meant that you were a fancy girl. And then the sort of dark full skirt. The Golem, one of the main characters in the first book, she She wears these, she buys these. She, as part of figuring out clothing, she has to figure out her way around shirtwaists. In fact, in the first version of that book, well, in the published version of the book, she works at a bakery. In the first version of the book, she sews shirtwaists for a living. So that's one of the things that you sort of have to figure out, and you have to teach the reader what a shirtwaist is as you're describing it. But as far as things like vocabulary and portcullis and whatever, and do I think they're going to know that? Do I not think they're not going to know that? I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got just in writing in general that applies to this as well is write the book that you want to read that no one has written yet. And if you know what portcullis is, your readers are going to know what a portcullis is. And yeah, you can maybe if you are writing about something that is rather esoteric and you are one of a very small number of people who knows about this and you want to give that information to the world in general, then yeah, you're going to have to do a little more explaining than usual. But if you're just writing about stuff that's gleaned from the popular culture and the books and the shows and the movies that you're interested in, and other people are interested in this stuff too, then yeah. Hell, anyone who's watched Game of Thrones knows what a portcullis is. You've seen people impaled on top of them. So, trust your gut.
In the back in the green. Yeah, whatever.
It's very dark green.
This question's for Garth. I was just wondering if you have any plans to revisit the worlds from, let's say, the Seventh Tower or the Keys to the Kingdom in the future.
Okay, the Seventh Tower books were written for Lucasfilm. They were commissioned by Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm owned them completely, which means that when Disney bought Lucasfilm, now Disney own the Seventh Tower completely. So I have no control over those books whatsoever. I'm not even sure they know that they own them, but unfortunately, there's nothing I can do with them, and I have no plans to in any case. The Keys to the Kingdom is a very complete series to me. I told the big story I wanted to tell. That said, I could certainly go back and find there's plenty of spaces to tell stories. There's plenty of characters I could look at other aspects of their life. Susie Blue, for example, I think has probably got quite a few stories she's taken part in, but I have no plans to do so. But I'm always very cautious about saying I won't, because apparently I once did years ago, and then I've been called on it since. After Sabriel, I said I'm never writing any Old Kingdom books. I have no memory of this, but one book that claims that I told him I was never going to write a sequel to Sabriel, and then the next time I saw him was for Lirael, and he was like, "You said you were never going to write this," and I said, "No, I didn't." So, anyway, so yes, I don't know. I have no plans. It's unlikely, but you never know.
Please. Yeah. The guy with the beard and the bun.
This question is for Garth. If you had to choose one of the worlds that you created to live in, which would you choose and why? And what would your role be?
None of the above. Because they're dangerous. I'd be too frightened. But it's a good question, because maybe when I wrote Sabriel, I was in my late 20s. Maybe I would have been brave enough then. I'm certainly not brave enough now, because I try and make those worlds real, and that means frightening, and people die, and certainly a soft character like myself cast into one of those worlds now wouldn't last very long. I would love to visit the Library of Declare. If maybe 30 armed librarians came with me, I would be okay with that. I would be safe enough, that's for sure. A lot of the things in my books are things I would like to be real. The Abhorsen's house, but I'd want the walkway that exists in Clariel's time, not the stepping stones. But yeah, I'd love to visit them, but it's like time travel. Time travel would be great as long as you know you're not going to get hit in the head with a cannonball. So if you could visit and be safe, I would love to visit them. But yeah, I think I would just not last, so I wouldn't be brave enough.
Please, in the back there.
I'm curious how long the cord is on this microphone. How far back can it go? Yeah.
I have a question for Helen regarding emails and international readership. Have you had any correspondence from Orthodox Jews in New York City, Lubavitchers, or from Israel, or from any mixed families that are Hebraic Islamic or Hebraic Arab? I'm very curious about feedback from all the scholarship that went into your novel.
Let's see. I get emails from Arab American readers. I get emails from Jewish readers in this country and other countries. I have gotten a couple emails from Israel. They did publish it in Hebrew in Israel. What's really cool is different places that the book has been sold include the Tenement Museum in New York City, the Arab American Museum in, I think, Lansing, Michigan, or Dearborn, and the Jewish Museum right here in town, as well as countless JCC bookstores. I do get emails every once in a while from people of mixed heritage. I got one email a number of years ago from a very heartbreaking email from a woman who was Orthodox Jewish and had met an Arab American, a Muslim American man through her job, and they had had a relationship, a romance, for a couple of years and then broken up because they just couldn't get past the religious difference. And her question to me was whether the book was going to come out in Arabic because he didn't like to read in English because his English wasn't good enough, and she wanted him to read this book. And I was like, oh my God. Unfortunately, no, it hasn't come out in Arabic, so that story never finished. But no one yet has written me with anything more excoriating than, here's a detail you got wrong. I don't know if that's going to survive the second book. I think I sort of got the leeway that's awarded to debut writers and, I don't know, younger writers, I don't know. But next time, I think I'll ruffle a few more feathers. We'll see. Dun, dun, dun.
Please. Please.
Hi, I have two disclaimers. I've only read stuff from the Old Kingdom, so this question only references that. And also, I haven't read a lot of your interviews online, so I think this will be a rehash material. But why YA, and how come your books are so female-oriented? I think out of the gender charter stone origin people, 4 of them are female, and it's just very rare to see that in YA fantasy from a male author.
So the first question, why YA, is that I actually don't write YA. I just write books, and then publishers work out, how they'll be sold. And that's kind of a facile question, but I really don't think about who they're for when I start writing them. And at some point in the writing of them, to me, it becomes clear whether they're going to be a children's book, which is not a young adult book. I mean, I write a lot of children's books as well as. So sometimes I realise that, okay, this is going to be a children's book, which has a different sensibility and tone and content than a YA book. But to me, the young adult books really are adult books that just happen to be particularly appealing to young adults, which is why publishers want to put them there. I mean, interestingly, the Old Kingdom books are published as just fantasy in Australia. And various times publishers have thought about doing them just as fantasy in other countries. Young adult is a very broad category now. It's become a very, very broad category. So it includes all kinds of stuff, including books which really are very specifically for teenagers and don't spread more widely, and then books which have great appeal to teenagers but also for older adults. I mean, I always say that it's called young adult. It's not called older children. It is, and young adults are adults. And typically the only reason that it'll get classified as YA with these books is because the protagonists tend to be young. I mean, most of my protagonists are like 18, which is very interesting from a storytelling perspective, because that is a great age to tell a story about someone, because it's when you first start working out, really, or continuing to work out who you are, what you're going to do, and so on. And of course, in the Old Kingdom and in my other books, they're nearly always in a very difficult world where you have to grow up very fast. Just as in the old days, when you were 14, you could get married and you could join the Navy or whatever. You were an adult. There weren't teenagers. They were not young adults. You just stopped being a child. When your parents died of plague and you had to go and farm, you were an adult. So to me, again, I think the categorisation is really a publishing thing, which they do, and publishers choose categories based upon where they think they'll sell the most books to begin with. Like, who is the core audience who can get the most book sales initially, but you always hope they will spread more widely. So even children's books, you always hope that, okay, the core audience for these books is going to be kids from 8 or 9 upwards, but the good ones get read by adults as well. And so you always hope that they will spread. But so the category is really about where does it go first. In terms of writing many female heroes as well as male ones, and I do write both, it kind of goes back to Sabriel, where with Sabriel, I wanted to reverse a whole bunch of stereotypes. So I wanted to write something about necromancers, but I wanted to write about good necromancers. So I wanted to flip that around. And I wanted my hero to be different as well. And one of the ways to be different back then, when Sabriel first came out in '95, was just to make her a girl, which is wrong. There should have been tons of fantasy novels with female protagonists. And there were some really great ones which were influential, very influential on me. I mean, Tamara Pierce's Alana books, Robin McKinley's The Hero and the Crown and the Blue Sword, very influential. Ursula Le Guin, The Tombs of Atuan and Tenar. I mean, so there was some really brilliant examples. There just weren't that many of them compared to all the others. So one of the easiest ways that I could try and reverse some stereotypes was simply to make her a woman. But that probably wouldn't have been enough, except that when I wrote the prologue, I was sort of tossing up in my mind, because I knew I wanted my anti-necromancers, and I was thinking, I'm not sure who I'm going to write about. Maybe it's going to be about her father. When I wrote the prologue, and I often do write prologues or first chapters just to sort of find out for myself what the tone of the book is going to be. When I wrote that prologue, I thought, where Sabriel is brought back from death when she's born by her father, I thought, she is much more interesting than he is. I'm going to write about her. So it was kind of a happy accident. So I had been thinking about trying to, do some different things, but I really think it came down to that she was more interesting, and that's why I wanted to write about her. But the other thing is, I've always found it kind of funny. People ask me, Garth, how do you write strong female characters? They don't say, how do you write about mordicants made of grave mould and blood? Because there actually are lots of strong women everywhere. There's not hideous monsters everywhere. So it's kind of like, all I have to do is look around to write the women. I grew up with strong, capable, super smart women. I've been lucky to share, my life with many of them. It's not a big deal. I just steal little bits and pieces from all the people I know. And so to me, I just try and write well-rounded humans. And sometimes the stories feel like they should have, the main character will just turn out to be a woman, and sometimes it'll turn out to be a man. But that said, in the Old Kingdom, I also very consciously try and make it a place where you can be anything of either gender. And I don't even talk about it. So, a tracker will appear, or a soldier, or whatever, and they, I may say they're a woman, I might not. But you can just presume that they could be either. There's not that automatic assumption that this super tough, warrior will be a man. It could easily just be a woman. And most of the time, half the time at least, it will be. I'm starting to ramble now, and I apologise. Next question.
I'm starting to applaud. Please.
My question is directed to both of you. With National Novel Writing Month just around the corner, I would like to know, when you start writing, do you just start, or do you have some sort of a plot device or plot map? And how much do you plan out before you start writing?
So I feel like both of these. Oh, okay, I have a data point of one completed book, as opposed to this gentleman over here.
He's only got 25 or 30.
Only. So I basically backed sideways into writing a novel that I thought was a short story that just kept going on and on and on, and I had to have other people tell me, no, this is actually a novel. Once that happened, I drew up immediately a very long and detailed outline that took me, I think, a couple weeks, and then I broke it immediately within about a day or two of writing. And just take that process and iterate it about 8,000 times, and that's how I write a book, ridiculously. I will do the outline, and then I will start writing, and at some point I will realize that the outline is an absolute sack of crap. And I then have to figure out why, and then go back and write some more. And at some point around here is when I start to figure out, oh wait, the theme isn't what I actually thought the theme was going to be. Here is the theme over here, which is this thing that's been in my subconscious this whole time. And then that comes out, and that means you have to change the outline again, and then I go back and I write a bunch more. So it's this tortuous process that sort of is like building a book and meeting a friend at the same time, where it's like you're not sure who this person is, but you're building the person at the same time that you're figuring them out. I know that is not I don't know if it's the norm. I know it's not everyone's norm. I know there are a lot of people who are much more diligent about sitting down and writing out that outline and then just basically expanding the outline, and that becomes the book. I know there are people who I went to school with who would write a book all the way through and then take a look at it and say, oh, okay, I'm going to keep this, 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 and this, and then start the whole process over again. I thought those people were crazy. So for this current book that I'm working on, I did that whole outline thing because I had to sell it. I had to basically sell it to my publisher. That outline at this point is, I look at it and I laugh. But I'll tell you one thing. I have 80,000 words. About 45,000 of them are usable. I am shooting for 150,000. The book is due in a year and 2 days. And not that I'm counting in the least. And I am doing NaNoWriMo for my own book, which I know is a no-no. When you talk to the actual NaNoWriMo people, they're like, you have to start from the beginning with a fresh sheet of paper, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I cannot do that. I am under contract. However, I am just going to write and write and write and write for the month of November. And at the end of that, see what sort of huge whack of material I have, and then go back and turn it into something workable.
It's always interesting listening to other writers talk about their processes, because there is no norm. I mean, there really is no norm. There's so many different ways to write books, and it's always fascinating to hear other people talk about their processes. And occasionally, things overlap slightly. You think, oh yeah, I do that as well, but I don't do that other thing. So it's always very interesting. I tend to think about things for quite a long time, and I'll make notes in a little black and red notebook like this one by preference. I've got one blue and white striped one, which I hate. So I will make some notes and I will just think about it, and they're often fairly amorphous at that point. They're sort of images. There might be a character in a setting, and I'll make a few notes, and then at some point that will kind of coalesce together, and I will write the prologue or the first chapter. And often I actually don't use these. They don't end up being the prologue or the first chapter of the book. They're kind of an exercise to establish the tone of the story that I want to write. And so I'll do that, and then I will write an outline. And I will write a chapter outline, just in a paragraph for each chapter, saying what's going to happen in that chapter. and then I'll go away and start writing the book, which will have no resemblance to outline whatsoever. Very much the same as Eleanor. I mean, but I do think, I think they're kind of like Zen outlines. I need to write them in order not to follow them. So the process of doing it is important, because I always do it, even though I never follow it. So that works for me. But at the same time, I know lots of people who don't outline. I know people who outline very, very rigorously and then follow it exactly, and that works for them, and they write brilliant books. You know, I've always quite liked the American thing, or as I heard it from an American, you know, whether you're a plotter or a pantser, you know, whether you plan everything out or you just go for it. Except the first time I heard it, someone said to me, "Are you a plotter or a panzer?" I thought they said. And it's like, I thought, like, what, a panzer? A panzer tank? What does that mean? Like I destroy my writing as I go? And then it became clear, you know, what a pantser was from the seat of the pants. So everyone's different, and I think it's good to experiment and see what happens, and try outlining and try not outlining. And you know, I was reading again, one of my favourite authors, P.G. Wodehouse. He would outline quite comprehensively. Then he would choose. He would then order what he thought were the most difficult sequences, and he would start with the most difficult first. But that first difficult sequence might be 2/3 of the way through the book. So he'd write that, then he might go back towards the beginning, and then, you know, all over the place. And what he thought, yeah, it's totally crazy. But also because he's looking at his outline and thinking what's the most difficult, and then of course in the writing discovering that that's not necessarily so. So there's all kinds of different methods and techniques. I'm personally going to do no remo. I'm not going to write it all in November. That's not true either. I just thought I'd say that. I think it's great. I think those concentrated bouts of writing with encouragement from others are a really good thing, because the encouragement of others doing the same thing. You know, I often get just being with other writers and talking about writing makes me want to do more of it, which is a good thing given it's my profession. You know, so. I was starting to wander again there. I apologise.
We've got time for like 2 more questions, and they should be very intelligent questions. And you in the back on the aisle, please. Yes, in the grey sweater.
Hi. So this is a question for Mr. Nix. I'm a teacher of deaf and hard of hearing students, and we're doing a fantasy unit right now, and I haven't been completely honest with them about what my favorite fantasy book is, because it's actually the Abhorsen series.
Thank you.
Because I don't know how the bells affect students, or not students, but people who are deaf. And also because in the Ninth Gate, how do people who are blind get affected by the stars?
Sure. It's a good question. In fact, I was asked this question fairly recently, and my answer was that the bells would work whether you could hear them or not. You know, the sound is not the magic of the bell. You know, the sound is something that goes along with the magic of the bell. So you would hear the bell whether you actually had hearing or not, if that makes sense, if you know what I mean. You would feel the effects of it in your body, even if it wasn't coming through your ears. You would feel the effects of the bell. And similarly, I think through the Ninth Gate, this, you know, I guess it's something. It's kind of a spoilerish discussion, I guess, in some ways. But you know, when you pass through the Ninth Gate, the river takes you through the Ninth Gate, and you die the final death. What you're being called up to, what your brain supplies to you, might not be the same for everybody. You know, in the books, it's described as a sea of stars they fall up into. That might not be what everybody experiences. And if you were blind, you would have some other sensation, no doubt. But also all your sensations are falling away by that stage anyway. So I hope, does that answer the question? So that, yeah, thank you. Wow. That was a good question.
And we have another. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you thought there was a particularly Australian sensibility of speculative fiction, and what that might look like. You, the Mad Max series, Isabel Carmody, Karen Healy.
Crikey, look at that science fiction book. Staying the crows, I haven't been asked that for a while. No, it's a good question. And it's one that I don't really have a good answer for, because it's one that I talk about with some of my Australian friends, because I do have friends who write things which are much more self-obviously Australian. My friend Sean Williams, who I co-wrote the Trouble Twisters book with, has a fantasy series called The Stone Mage and the Sea, which is set in the deserts of South Australia. It's very much, the geography is very much a part of those stories. Whereas I myself, I don't feel like I do write a particularly, my being Australian is not a particularly important part of my work, except maybe there is a certain sort of larrikinism which is prevalent in sort of Australian culture.
Larrikinism?
Larrikinism.
What the hell's that?
I can't believe I have to explain it. You know, I talked about it before. If you can look it up on the internet. No. I guess that is an example of some Australian vocabulary. I guess larrikin is a bit of a trickster, a bit of a joker, and a sort of lightness of heart. And I think particularly there's a sort of culture of an Australian larrikin is someone who will use humour to make light of very bad situations. They'd come past and see their friend's house is on fire and say, see you've given up smoking then, or something like that. It's that sort of making light of things. And I think there's some of that in some of my characters in the book. That kind of humour is perhaps an Australian thing, but I'm really not sure. It's probably something someone else needs to work out for me. But I guess I write in a very English tradition of fantasy, as do American authors. But we sort of bring something of where we grew up and our countries and so on. We can't help but infuse some of that into the books. But lots of people lots of people don't know I'm Australian, so they think I'm American or they think I'm English or something else. And I think if there was a sort of overt Australianism in the books, they would pick that up or figure it out. Does that kind of answer the?
But you're sort of saying fantasy is at core of an English genre, which makes kind of sense.
Yeah.
I think of it. Yeah.
Yeah. If you trace back the big tree has branched in many directions.
Yeah.
And of course some fantastic American fantasists have really taken some of those branches a long way out. But going back,
makes sense.
Through into Shakespeare, Spencer, but then also going back to the classical myths and so. That's a long other conversation.
Yeah.
And of course,
there's certainly other world cultures that have produced an amazing amount of fantasy, but in the fantasy that we're sort of
English
used to, it comes from.
Yeah, but in a broad stroke, you could say a modern SF is sort of an American thing, and modern fantasy comes out.
Well, in the sort of the main channel we've had for a long time, but there's been a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
And there's
some of the most
go.
awesome stuff coming up now is more other world culture than Western. But certainly that has been the association for years.
And I'm talking about my own particular stuff too.
It might be one of those things where, like you said, it's like you need someone else to tell you. Whereas, like, if you're too close to it.
Yeah, and they will ultimately at some point. I know people write papers and things. And,
are you
tell you
turning
about,
up in papers?
Yeah, they tell you, they say I've written my thesis about your work, and I think this, and I want to, and I read, I think, okay. I'm really not sure about that, but but sometimes I think, okay, I had no idea, but that actually does seem perfectly reasonable. Maybe that's what I was doing, So it's always interesting. Anyway,
and you need to do your thesis, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's good someone's reading them and thinking about it, and sometimes people tell you things and you learn something about your own work.
Well, listen, we've got a lot of books to sign, and I have to say, I've been doing this for years. Tonight was fun. And you guys, everybody contributed a lot. And we always have really good writers. But most of them are not very intelligent, and they don't really have anything to say. And so tonight was extraordinary. So I want to thank both of you.
The SF&SF podcast was produced by Marin McDonnell, recorded and engineered by Rusty Hodge. Thanks for listening. So